Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IAB Make Mobile Work webinar series. For today's webinar, we'll be talking about mobile publisher monetization. My name is Eva Wu, Director at IAB Mobile Center of Excellence, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We've got a great lineup of thought leaders who will be speaking today, and I'll introduce them one by one before their respective segment. A couple notes on logistics before we get started. So everyone is currently muted. If you would like to ask questions, please write to us through the moderator chat on the control panel. And we'll answer some questions as we go along and also queue up some for the Q&A session at the end. And one of the questions we get a lot is whether a recording of the webinar will be available. We'd like to let you know that the answer is yes, and we'll send you a follow-up email with the recording after the webinar. So before we get started with the content, I want to provide you with a little background on the IAB Make Mobile Work initiative. The IAB Make Mobile Work webinar series is a major initiative out of the IAB Mobile Center, which is the mobile hub within IAB. And its mission is to drive the growth of mobile advertising, marketing, and media. The Make Mobile Work initiative aims to provide marketers and publishers with practical, jargon-free advice on mobile advertising best practices to help them excel in an increasingly mobile, always omni-screen world. For today's webinar, the topic is mobile monetization for publishers. So here's a quick stat from IAB Digital Usage Trend Report full year 2016, which you can find on the IAB.com Research Hub. So the bar on the left shows that 69% of all time spent online is spent on mobile devices. And the bar on the right from the IAB PwC 2016 Digital Ad Revenue Report shows that over half, about 51% of all digital advertising revenue is generated from mobile ads. So consumer time spent is clearly higher on mobile than desktop. However, it hasn't translated to advertising dollars for publishers on mobile. So today we're going to focus on sharing some best practices and case studies on what have been working for publishers, and we'll cover 3 different aspects in publisher monetization: creative, technology, and data. So we'll hear first from a publisher and see how they have adapted to the mobile always world and are engaging users with creative formats that are native for the mobile experience. And following that, we'll discuss the current mobile programmatic technologies and how publishers can leverage them to make their business more efficient. And we'll wrap up with some case studies on how to use mobile data to enrich your audience segmentation and increase the value of your inventory. And in particular, we'll focus on mobile location data as it's a unique data point of the mobile medium and that it provides a lot of potential for publisher monetization. Then there will be a Q&A session at the end. But as I mentioned, feel free to ask questions and provide any comments anytime through the moderator chat, and there's no need to wait until the end. We'll discuss some of the questions along the way. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kristen Burke, Senior Manager of Entertainment at LA Times, who will show us some engaging creative units designed for readers on mobile. Take it away, Kristen.
Thanks, Eva, and hi, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the creative formats that we've been implementing specifically at the LA Times, but also at our parent company, Tronc, which owns 9 different major websites across the country. So first and foremost, I want to give you a look at kind of where our traffic sits vis-a-vis desktop, mobile, and tablet web. So if you see this, you can get a sense of just how much of our traffic is really coming from mobile and tablet. Just with the LA Times alone, over 50% of our traffic is coming from mobile. Same with ChicagoTribune.com, and in some cases, we have over 70% of our traffic coming from mobile and tablet web. So with those numbers in mind, it's really no surprise that we've been investing a ton in new creative formats for mobile lately, and that's really become kind of a paramount initiative for us here at LA Times and at Tronc. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are kind of the four major principles that we ascribe every time we're looking at deploying a new creative mobile unit. The first one is that it, of course, be innovative. So we want to make sure that we're measuring engagement rates and not just impressions and CTRs, and looking at the metrics that we can deliver on. Of course, we want it to be aesthetically pleasing. So we're looking at ad units that are, of course, responsive to not just one or two specific devices, but all devices across the market. And then, of course, delight and not disrupt. So no pop-ups, no banners, anything that ascribes by those, we like to pass over. And then this is our first unit. It's the mobile wrapper. So we use this a lot actually in FYC campaigns for our TV and film clients. I wanted to show you guys how this unit performs against our normal CTR benchmark at 0.13%. So this unit had a 2% CTR, and we can measure scroll rate and the number of scrolls, which is defined as user-initiated vertical change up and down of at least 5% of the ad height. And this unit is also great because it lends itself really well to our entertainment clients in that you can leverage 3 different sets of creative in the unit. It kind of functions like an elevator in that it automatically changes as the user scrolls up and down, as well as housing different creative in the header on the left and in the footer on the right. Next slide, please. So this is another unit that we've been seeing a ton of success with, especially in the entertainment vertical. It was sort of our answer to the video wall, which we've been running for a little over 2 years. But unlike the video wall, the video scroll is mobile and tablet compatible. So these units actually see about a 3 to 7% CTR across mobile and tablet devices. And the horizontal skin, where the longer form videos can be housed, which is visible on the right side of the screen, those see about a 2% higher CTR on mobile and tablet versus desktop. So basically every single campaign that we have, if there are video assets available, we try and leverage this unit as much as possible because of how well it performs across mobile and tablet web for us. Next slide, please. So this is another unit that we actually just launched literally a week ago. So it's brand new and we don't have a ton of data on it, but it's called the Lighthouse unit. And it functions similarly to the video scroll. It's entirely responsive across all devices on the market. And it kind of replaces the video interstitial for us in many ways. Starting in Q1, we'll no longer be running the video interstitial at all. But this unit is different in that it can run both static and video. And unlike some of the other video units, this one can accommodate data targeting with partners that we use like Crux, so we can get pretty granular with our targeting capabilities here, as well as, of course, leverage any first-party data that we may want to apply as well. This user is also super user-friendly in that it has kind of an inherent scroll functionality to it, while still sitting in one of our most prominent and viewable placements on the site. It's the first thing the user sees, and it is always 100% above the fold across all of our sites. Next slide, please. So this unit's called the Hyperscroller. This is one unit that we leverage in partnership with YieldMo, who's our primary mobile and tablet partner. So this has a feature that is very cool called Position Aware, which essentially detects exactly where the user is on the screen. It can also accommodate up to 20 frames of animation. And essentially, it's optimized more for upper funnel brand campaigns and works very well in the entertainment and audio verticals. Similar to the first unit I shared, the wrapper, this one can also house up to 3 different sets of creative, and those will automatically be displayed as their user scrolls up and down. So you see similar metrics and performance rates to the wrapper unit, which are much higher than our averages across the site. Next slide, please. So this is a look at some of the categories that we bucket all of our different mobile reporting metrics into. Of course, you have your general ones, CTR, CVR, start time and end time. We also categorize them just by the video metrics that we can accommodate. So usually we'll accommodate those by quartile. And then as swipe and engagement rates come into play, we'll look at total swipes. In some cases, when we're running units like a carousel unit or a catalog unit that's leveraging multiple products, we'll look at the pane number, the last pane view, the last click pane. In many cases with units that I didn't share today, we'll also have forms actually embedded into the mobile and tablet units. So we'll look at the number of forms that were submitted and filled out within those units. And then metrics that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Time spent, average time, countable impressions, and then last but not least, the scroll engagement rates. And then this is just a look at how we're defining many of these units. So one of the units that I wanted to show you guys, but we actually don't have a ton of data on it yet, is called the shadow box unit. It's a very new type of unit for us in that it actually leverages different tilting functionality. So one of the metrics that we apply is looking at when the user is kind of moving their phone, what the tilt rate is, and then we'll report upon that based on how many users are looking at the gyroscope functionality of the unit itself. And then, yeah, other units like the scroll, the swipe, click through, video play. If you guys have any questions about how we're defining these, please let me know. And I think that's it. So yeah, let me know.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Kristen. We'll see. I'll let you also pipe through any questions as they come. So it's very helpful to hear from the publisher perspective, and thank you very much for sharing what's going on at LA Times. So now that we've seen how a publisher is telling their mobile story through creatives, let's get a little geeky and take a mini course on the mobile programmatic technologies, which help enable higher EOs for publishers. So I think as a publisher, whether you manage direct sales or programmatic, it is useful to stay up to date on the current capabilities and future roadmaps for advertising technology. So with that, I'd like to introduce Marina Gu, who's the Senior Director of Customer Enablement at PubMatic. Marina?
Perfect. Thanks, Eva. So glad to be talking to you here today. I'll talk a bit, like Eva said, about what basically we can think about from a publisher monetization standpoint for programmatic. So what are the solutions available today? What can we set up to make the most of what programmatic has to offer today and to set you up well for the future? So the conversation within programmatic has really been dominated by one thing. If you read any of the multiple media sources out there on this, and it's really about header bidding. So, in 2015 and 2016, a lot of the conversation was really around, well, what is this, as it was a new technology and really education. In 2017, the conversation started to shift away from what is it towards what kind of implementation is really best for publishers. So the kind of language used is client side versus server side. And if you're not sure what that means, that's okay. I'll go into what that really means. But the undercurrent of all of this chatter has been an assumption on desktop only. So there's really been limited conversation on what the header solution looks like for a mobile app, basically what's the equivalent. And so that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about today. And so why, basically before I jump into what this looks like for mobile app, why is this something that publishers have been talking about, at least in the desktop context? And just for those who aren't super familiar with this, the main benefit is really twofold. So ultimately, it's a matter of generating more yield within the programmatic space. So why does a header implementation generate more yield? In short, a header implementation is basically a real-time call, and it allows the publisher to get the real-time willingness to pay from a buyer as opposed to sort of general historic CPMs guiding which SSP is called. So instead of calling in a waterfall with passbacks, you're calling each SSP and thus each demand source in real time to get that real-time willingness to pay. You also get competition among those SSPs and thus demand sources. So what we call bid density, basically, instead of having a single call and having to take that ad through that single call based off that historical CPM, you're getting multiple calls and thus competition across those different SSPs that are called, which drive meaningful revenue increase. So we typically see a 30 to 60% revenue increase from the simple adoption of a header solution from a tag-based solution. So, 70% of, sorry to go back, Eva, 70% of publishers actually use header today, at least in the US. And it's really because of this yield benefit that we see, so that 30 to 60% benefit. And, primarily, again, we've seen that adoption happen in the desktop environment, even though, 1 in 5 impressions, only 1 in 5 impressions are coming through header bidding, which obviously doesn't even reflect the total, basically, mind share of users. So, increasingly, we know that users are moving to mobile apps, and that's only going to continue. So for buyers to get that engagement, they have to understand how to move towards mobile app. And so I think, there's that understanding from the buy side, and we can better capitalize from the publisher side with the kind of tech that we're using to make sure we're driving that yield. And you see the right indications here. So with those 70% of publishers using header bidding, that's again been mostly on desktop. And so you see what the yield benefit has been like in mobile web. So in mobile web, we actually saw a nearly 50% increase in CPMs from that move. And that's a good indication of what we could expect to see in mobile app. And so, even though we still are, for the most part, in mobile app monetizing on this sort of old school way of integrating, and I'll talk about a little bit about what that looks like in a bit, we still see meaningfully higher CPMs in mobile app versus mobile web. So in other words, there's a lot of money being left on the table here in terms of the monetization benefit that we could expect to see from mobile app. And that mobile in-app monetization continues to increase despite still using that that lesser integration source, that lesser sort of implementation type. And that really reflects the willingness from the buyer side and the interest from the buy side to monetize in the mobile app environment. And so why would a header implementation matter for in-app monetization? So I talked a little bit about some of the yield benefits that publishers see when we're in a desktop environment. But from a mobile app environment, there's a couple of nuances that I want to touch upon. So, first, when we're talking about mobile app integrations, we're talking either about an SDK-based integration using mediation. So in other words, the individual SSP software development kits are integrated within each mobile app. And mediation basically monitors who's called and who's allowed to fill that ad call. It's either a combination of SDK mediation, like I just explained, or tags. And there are pros and cons to both. I won't go too deep since that's sort of like the old school setup. But basically, just talk about that to illustrate that either way, whether you're using SDK mediation or tags in your mobile app ad server, either way, you're still using a waterfall. So you're still deciding which buy-side source to call based off historic CPM. So, if PubMatic is in your ad stack, you say, PubMatic historically brings me a $2 CPM, and that's the highest of the SSPs that I have in this ad call. And so I'm going to call that SSP based off of that historic, but it doesn't capture that real-time willingness to pay. The meaningful, sorry, to go back, there's also a meaningful driver in terms of latency here. So, when either you have multiple SDKs that you have to integrate and activate in a waterfall basis, or you're talking about a waterfall in the ad server. And either way, there's meaningful latency that you have in the mobile app environment that obviously puts a load on the user experience. And then lastly, the complexity. And this for me is really the kicker in mobile apps. So the SDK mediation is better from a data perspective, and Brian will talk about that a little bit more, but basically the SDK allows the buy-side source to get more data from the mobile app, thus making it better, easier for them to monetize and deliver against their campaign targets and KPIs. But it's really hard to integrate from the publisher side. So it's really complex to set up that initial SDK. And of course, the more monetization partners have, the more SDKs that you have to integrate. And there's really a lot of risk there on the overall app, as opposed to the level of risk you have in a desktop experience when you're doing JavaScript. So when we look towards in-app header, it would help solve for this. So what would this really look like? And I know this may look a little complex, but the fundamental principles are pretty simple, so bear with me a little bit. So when we have a user that comes to that mobile app, basically an in-app header call would allow each individual SDK to be called when that user comes to opens that app. So, let's say it's a gaming app. I load this application, the game is loading, there are a number of tools that are being activated, like analytics tools for that overall app and crash performance tools. In addition, the SDK is called for each individual SSP. So SSP1, SSP2, SSP3 are each called through their individual SDKs that have already been integrated, and they can each run their auction on their side in real time for that single ad call. And so they get the real-time willingness to pay from their buyers by running their auction in real time, and they submit that real-time willingness to pay back to the app, who then says, okay, SSP2 had the highest bid, and I'm going to pass that highest bid to the ad server. So this accomplishes two things that we talked about before, and I'll reiterate here. So one is that real-time willingness to pay. So instead of deciding who you're calling based on a historical CPM, you get that real-time interest from the HSSP, from their demand sources. And the second thing is the bid density. So here you can have, however many SDKs you're willing to implement is the number of SSPs that you're able to call. And that causes each SSP to compete against one another. So you don't have to take, one SSP's word for it on what they're willing to pay. You can ensure competition, and whoever has that highest CPM is able to win. And those are the two dynamics that really drive the meaningful revenue increase that we've seen when publishers move toward the header bidding integration, and primarily on the desktop side. This would hold true on the in-app side. But the meaningful thing I want to call out here is that this doesn't really solve some of the complexity issues that I talked about earlier. So this sort of integration would still require that each SSP's SDK is integrated into that app. So there's still that sort of issue for the developer in terms of getting those SDKs integrated, which is non-trivial. And there's also the issue of the load on the user experience. So, each SDK has to be activated, which would slow down the overall load time of the app. So what does that mean for what we should look to implement for programmatic from the mobile app perspective? And really, it goes back to this same concept we had on the desktop side of the client side versus the server side. So the flow I just walked you through is basically what we would refer to as client side. So activation directly through the app, or in the desktop environments, we talk a bit about it as directly through the browser. And a server-to-server integration is really a question of that initial call is triggered through the browser for that real-time call, but all of the action happens offline. So instead of the action, loading down on the app or on the browser, we're really talking about that activity with the SSPs happening offline. So what does this look like? So you have a single SDK call to a single partner, which then basically there's some things that happen offline that I haven't included here, but in short, basically that SDK call triggers server-to-server calls to each of the individual SDKs. So again, you have a single SDK that's implemented from the programmatic ads perspective. And when the user opens that mobile app, that single SDK is activated and then migrates all of the activity to that partner's server to basically call each of the individual SSPs. So in this environment, for simplicity, I've kept the same number of SSPs, but when you have that call to each SSP happening offline, you can actually have a greater number of SSPs because you're basically, A, you don't have to integrate each individual SSP SDK, and then B, you don't have the load of all of that activity happening through the app. You can basically have that happen in an offline server that basically wouldn't have load on the user experience. So this is, in short, what we can expect to see more of in market. So, folks probably have heard of Prebid, the open source solution in the browser side, prebid.js. Prebid has just recently launched an SDK that looks a lot like this. So basically, you have that single Prebid SDK implementation, which then calls the servers and does the transactions offline. I think that's a great place to start to think about from a mobile app programmatic perspective to start to migrate your tech stack towards this sort of solution. And the holy grail would really be to have everything in a single ad call. So the one downside of this is that basically when the SSPs run their auction and submit that response back through that partner SDK, you still have to send that back to the ad server, and the ad server will go through your direct line items and decide I need to go towards the direct line item with a direct campaign that I've struck. The holy grail would really be to have all that happen. So you can, in a single ad call, so you can imagine that single partner SDK going to a server that has all the direct deals in that server and can also execute basically the auction with each individual SSP in that single server. But in absence of that kind of option, I would say this is an excellent place to move your ad stack towards, whether you choose Prebid or another partnership. Now, how do you think about who to choose? Because one of the risks of that sort of server-to-server header solution for a mobile app is that you're putting a lot of basically trust in that single partner to work for you. So, there are a couple of things that we've learned from the desktop environment that would apply in terms of best practices and things to keep in mind when you're choosing an in-app header solution. And so one is maximum monetization opportunity, right? So the number one reason why we do this is because it drives meaningful yield increase in programmatic. And so, the thing you need to keep in mind is basically, does this partner have all of the SSPs that I'd want to work with? Are they integrated, and can they execute those server-to-server calls with every partner that I want live? And that basically allows you to get more real-time calls and greater bid density from the partners that can monetize your inventory well. One important element to consider is simple operation. So there can be a lot of complexity in terms of how you integrate this, and can be a lot of work for your ad ops manager in terms of like connecting things between your programmatic solution and how you program that in your ad server. Not to mention the operations of managing that partner SDK and the connections with each SSP. So ensuring that there's a simple, clean implementation there for simple operational management for your ad ops manager is important. So one thing you can do is basically ask for demos, look at case studies, talk to fellow customers who have integrated the solutions to understand what that looks like. A third thing to keep in mind is reporting and analytics. So, when you have a single SDK that's doing all those individual SSP calls, ideally you can have that solution provide holistic reporting of each individual SSP, at least some of that baseline metrics of tracking overall returns, overall fill rate, overall latency, and so on. And then lastly, someone who's transparent and independent. So, one way to do this is to choose an open source solution or an open source based solution. And so basically the importance of having a transparent, independent solution is that it instills trust in each SSP that they believe that they're being treated with fair, basically auction rules. And thus they have trust and will be willing to participate freely. Going back to that first point on getting the max number of monetization partners that possible. And choosing a partner that you think will scale with you well. So scale their solutions and their offerings to support different sales channels, whether that's a greater cohesiveness within programmatic, so between open marketplace and private marketplace, or even greater cohesiveness across all of your sales channels. And a solution that basically you feel confident will innovate with you over time. So lots to consider. Hopefully that was useful in terms of laying out basically where we see mobile app going in programmatic and why you should pay attention and why it can benefit your business long term.
Great. Thank you very much, Marina. I mean, I think that was very helpful. It's a compact presentation with lots of knowledge. So still trying to wrap my own head around that too. So definitely I'll give some time for the attendees for questions, but we do have actually some questions coming through, and there's one for Kristen for LA Times. So can you elaborate a little bit more about the Shadowbox unit, and is it a custom unit or served through a third party?
Yes, that unit is served through YieldMo, who is our primary mobile and tablet partner. And I can actually send through a demo link to how it works. But basically, as the phone is tilted, either to the left or to the right, the background actually tilts as well with it. So it really lends itself well to sort of a natural gyroscoping functionality. So not only are the impressions measured, but the degree at which the phone is actually tilting is measured as well. So similar to the same way that you measure kind of a quartile in videos getting played, you would measure exactly what percentage of the phone is getting tilted to the right or the left as the user plays with the unit itself.
Okay, got it. And can you recommend standard ways to measure scroll rate?
Yeah, I think the standard way to just measure the scroll rate would be, well, the way that we do it internally is to take the number of scrolls and just divide it by the total number of impressions, or in our case, the total number of viewable impressions. So that's sort of the standard that we would apply.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. So yeah, we have some other questions, and I'll queue them up for the Q&A session at the end because we have one more presenter coming up. So we've just talked about creatives and technologies, and next up, we'd like to address data and using it to improve relevance and value of your inventory. And in particular, since today we're talking about mobile publisher monetization, we want to focus on location data on mobile devices. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brian Hentley, CEO of Reveal Mobile. Brian?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Appreciate the time today. I think Kristen did a great job of talking about one of the big problems that we see in mobile, and that's with the creatives themselves. Early on, everybody sort of rushed to the 320 by 50, and this was a great opportunity to see that there's a lot better creative formats than just that. One of the other challenges that we see is there's just no cookies in mobile. So how do you create audience segmentation out of mobile? And that's one of the things that we try to solve. Mobile's fantastic. It's now you've got nearly 80% of the U.S. population that has mobile phones, and I think from the 18 to 24 or 25-year-olds, it's almost 100% or 95%. So it presents a great opportunity to have this device that's always with you, throwing off a lot of data based on where those users are going. And that essentially represents a cookie for the physical world, right? And it's a lot more than that. It's much more than just knowing that somebody looked at a web page. It's, you know, the ability to follow somebody through that entire journey from doing the research on a product that they're buying, making that purchase, and then even doing follow-up reviews, and it's all done on one device. So great opportunity to really focus on the consumer journey and leverage that. So next slide, please. The reality is, though, if you have, just like any data, right, it's only as good as what you do with it, right? It's just a pile of data until you have the ability to analyze that data and then turn that into something usable. And, you know, location data has a ton of power, right? If you're fortunate enough to have location data, you can use that to segment your audience. You'll know who's a business traveler, who is a golfer, who has been shoe shopping, who has been to an auto dealership. And so there's various ways that you can leverage that to your advantage in the advertising scenario. Go to the next slide. Some of the use cases that we see, and there's a lot more use cases than just these four, but, you know, the first one, and, you know, the one that I think most of the people have gone to, is real-time advertising, and that's, you know, geofencing. So, you know, ad request goes out, it's got a latitude and longitude associated with it. You look to see, do you have an ad that is relevant for that geographic area, or do you have a push alert? So it doesn't require a tremendous amount of sophistication to do geo-targeted ads. So it's, you know, if you're not doing that, that presents a great opportunity. The next one that we see a lot of is retargeting, and that takes a little bit more sophistication. That's where you really need audience segmentation. We had an interesting one that came in not too long ago where a publisher had an advertiser that was a fitness center that they wanted to retarget to their users, but they wanted to segment it differently. You know, they wanted the super users, anybody that'd been into a fitness center like 15 times in 30 days, versus somebody that only been 2 or 3 times in 30 days. And you have to have the ability to not just collect that data, but analyze it in order to enact that. And if you are fortunate enough to have location data, it also presents an opportunity to make money even without advertising. There are a number of companies now that do foot traffic reporting, that do attribution reporting, site analytics, things like that, that want access to mobile location data. And if you have it, it could provide another revenue stream for you. And it also affords the opportunity to do foot traffic and reporting and attribution reporting yourself. Cookies allowed you to do that for landing pages. Somebody saw an ad and went to a landing page. The mobile devices, right, you know that somebody saw an ad, and then you can show that that person actually went into a store. And we will get to the point, you know, as there are more and more mobile payment systems out there, where you would even be able to tie that to how much that individual purchased. You know, not only did they see the ad, but they went into the store and they bought $37 worth of merchandise. And that's really, you know, sort of the holy grail and where we'll get to. A lot of issues that have to be covered before we get there, though. So next slide, please. And the main one is privacy, right? As a publisher, if you have location data and you are leveraging that data for advertising purposes or for any purpose, there's several things to consider. You know, the first is the privacy of the end user. The thing that I want to emphasize the most is the more transparency you provide to the end user on how you're leveraging that data, the more accepting they're going to be in the use of that data. So, you know, honor any opt-outs. There's the do not track functionality in the operating systems. If users check that, that's something you absolutely need to honor. And then if you are doing anything with data, if you're selling data to some of the attribution companies or pushing data through into the ad servers, you need to make sure that contractually you have the right obligations in place, because the privacy from country to country, even in the United States, is sort of a moving target. Fortunately, there's a lot of great organizations like the IAB that are keeping up with all the changes that are happening in privacy. So there's tons of groups that you can get involved with that will get you up to speed on what needs to happen for you to A, collect the data, and then do something with that data. Next slide. So on to the fun stuff. Thought I'd give a few case studies of what some of our publishers have done. We work with about 600 mobile app publishers that use mobile location data in varying degrees, and so I thought I'd present just a few examples. This example is from a local publisher in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they have the North Carolina State Fair as a customer. And what the fair wanted to do was have more pre-sale tickets. So they went to the publisher and asked for ideas, and the publisher said, well, we'll look back at our audience data, because they'd been collecting it for over a year, and see how many users they had that were at the fair last year. And they had roughly 126,000 devices that they could place at the fair last year. So obviously that gave them a really good audience to go target to try to drive to the fair this year. And so I'll cover the results on the next slide. So as you can imagine, if you have a highly targeted audience, you're going to get better results. We got almost 1,000% increase in the click-through versus just the content or run-of-site ads, and 122% increase over the desktop ads. And the best thing was the publisher was able to, last year they were charging $5 CPMs, this year they went to $10 CPM. So it's pretty rare that a publisher, the CPMs are actually increasing. But this is a case where they had much more highly targeted data, so they were able to charge a lot more money. So everybody was happy. The advertiser got better results, and the publisher got additional revenue. So in the next case study, again, this is a local study as well. There was a hospitality chain, and it wasn't a chain, it was a group of differently named restaurants, but they were all casual dining restaurants, and they were getting ready to open their first fine dining establishment. So they went to the publisher for ideas. The publisher then looked at their audience base and said, well, we'll find you anybody that had been to another fine dining restaurant in the area, anybody that had been to one of their other casual dining facilities, because they thought there might be some brand loyalty, and then anybody that lived or worked nearby. And they found about 15,000 devices for near that one restaurant. And again, they got some pretty promising results, and we'll show you on the next slide. They had a 294% increase in compared to their content or run-of-site targeted ads, and a 92% increase over desktop. And again, the big advantage there was they were able to charge more, a higher CPM for these campaigns than they were for some previous campaigns. So again, publishers happy, advertisers happy as well. A couple more case studies. The next one was for a regional MOES operations, MOES Southwest Grill. And this is a little different because it wasn't necessarily click-throughs that they were looking for, it was coupon redemption. So they went to the publisher. The publisher, again, looked at their audience data and looked at any user that had been to a MOES previously and any user that had been to a competitor site like a Qdoba or a Chipotle. And they had about 18,000 devices that they could place around the MOES in that region. And the results were pretty good as well. We'll see that on the next slide, but they, again, instead of click-through, they were looking for coupon redemption, and they had a 67% increase in the redemption of coupons. So, they were obviously very happy because their cash register was ringing as a result of that. So even on different metrics, mobile is a great indicator. The last case study that I'll go over is with the Carolina Inn. And the Carolina Inn is a boutique bed and breakfast. It's right across the street from the University of North Carolina. And it does really well during football season. Right? Everybody that's tailgating comes in for the weekend, they stay at the Carolina Inn. And what they were trying to do was increase their occupancy rate during off season. So they came to the publisher with, the need. Publisher looked at their audience again. They looked at people who had been to tuxedo rental places, to bridal shops, to florists, to jewelers, and they found 1,500 devices. That is a very small sample set, but for one boutique hotel, they were very happy with that. And the other difference in this campaign was instead of advertising on the mobile apps for the actual publisher, the publisher was acting as a digital agency. And Carolina Inn wanted to reach these people on Facebook. So they took that data into Facebook, and we'll see the results on the next slide. If you, the publisher themselves went to Facebook to implement the campaign and saw that Facebook's wedding-based data that was geo-targeted, they recommended a $7 cost per click with a minimum bid of $2.20 cost per click. And that's using Facebook's data. And because they were able to export the device IDs that fit that category and import that into Facebook themselves, their actual cost was less than $1 cost per click. So the big thing is here, there was still a really good click-through rate of 2.6%. But the thing that made everybody happy was that there was a huge cost savings in implementing that campaign, up to 636% cost savings. So, the lesson there was, and candidly, this was news to me, that if, Facebook data, they have great data. There are some limitations to Facebook data, but it's expensive if you use Facebook's own targeting. If you have the ability to create your own audience segments and then export that into Facebook, it's much more economical. So this is just a few examples of some of the publishers that we've got that are doing a good job of leveraging mobile location data. And the big opportunity, there's obviously a big opportunity in mobile in general. Location data even makes that better. Location, obviously the cookie for mobile, but it offers a lot more. It offers the whole value chain of the consumer experience. But the key is, in order to leverage mobile location data, you have to have trust and transparency with the user. Otherwise, you might end up on the front page of a paper in a negative way. We don't want that to happen. And that's it. Happy to answer questions.
That's right. Thank you very much, Brian. Great presentation. So yeah, we have some questions queued up for the Q&A sessions for our speakers. Another question for Kristen at LA Times. So is the Lighthouse unit a solution to replace the interstitial because of the Google Chrome changes being made in Q1 2018? Pretty specific question.
Hi, sorry there, I was on mute.
Oh yeah, right.
So not necessarily. The implementation of the Lighthouse unit was really an answer to the interstitial. To be perfectly candid, we were getting some complaints from our clients about the invasiveness of the interstitial, and even though the CTRs tended to be pretty high, if we were really being honest with ourselves, a lot of those clicks were not necessarily intentional clicks. They were clicks that, happened either on accident or were the result of a user trying to click out of the interstitial, and we don't like that kind of data. So kind of powwowed internally to try and figure out a unit that could have the same or similar functionality as the interstitial and house video, most importantly, on mobile and tablet web, but without that sort of inherently invasive functionality. So the Lighthouse was what our design and ops team came up with, and we're excited to see how it performed. I think I mentioned we just launched it, so we don't have a ton of data yet on exactly the efficacy of it, but we have high hopes, certainly.
Okay, that makes sense. And another question is that as advertisers are getting more and more sophisticated with the scrutiny of data quality, how can publishers address advertisers' concern about lack of information on how the data is collected and passed through? So I guess that could be for Brian or really anyone, all the speakers.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in on that one. Privacy is a big issue for us because our whole model is around the leverage of mobile location data, and one of the challenges that you have from mobile, particularly in mobile apps, is the limitation from the operating system itself in terms of the message that you can actually deliver in terms of users accepting mobile location services. All right, so that's something that Apple is addressing. You'll see that in iOS 11 that they give users multiple options, and so they're becoming more and more transparent in what they do with mobile location data, and I think that's important. A lot of the publishers in the past with mobile location data have said, hey, would you allow us to use mobile location data? And it really didn't give the user the transparency that they were doing something with advertising. Not until you read the privacy policy did you actually see that that they were actually collecting that data and using it for mobile location targeting. And our philosophy is the more transparency that you can have with the user up front, the better. And that starts with the message that you deliver when somebody first downloads the app. The more transparent you can be up front, the more likely you are to get acceptance of that.
Okay, that's unfortunately all the time we have for today. We actually have a couple other questions, and we'll just follow up with you individually offline to answer your questions. So, and again, also we'll follow up with the link to the recording as well. So with that, I want to thank our speakers today for sharing their valuable insights, and thank you all for your attention. And we'll see you soon at our future events. Thank you.